So yeah, in this presentation, I'm going to outline components of my doctoral research into spatial finance. So without further ado, let's crack on. So based on my exploratory research into this emerging field, I will draw a link in this talk between spatial data infrastructures, green finance platforms, and finance, namely credit allocation and access to risk management services. There are many implications that stem from spatial finance, but credit rationing is by far the most impactful, potentially stranding assets and communities based on GIScience and data analytics. I draw out these links by addressing three research questions. What is spatial finance? How is the emergence of spatial finance changing the political economies of spatial data infrastructures? How do spatial data infrastructures configure the political economies and geographies of green finance? This paper draws on and foregrounds the relevance of critical GIS studies and approaches to understanding the geographies of green finance and forwarding its agenda, and highlights three implications we can already observe. So the deepening commercialization of spatial data infrastructures, new regulatory interest in GIScience and spatial data infrastructures, and configuring the geographies of green finance. So in 2017, when data collection began on this study, the term spatial finance, forwarded by Ben Caldicott at Smith School and Oxford University, had not been coined, nor had the Spatial Finance Initiative been founded. The field was at the point of an assemblage with coalescing fields of technology and finance, and the explicit importance of spatial data to green finance was limited to silos in academia, such as the Asset Level Data Initiative and insurance. As such, this study set out an exploratory mixed qualitative research approach to address the research questions in a time of rapid market development. The study adopted Rob Kitchen's data assemblage model to thematically analyze the evidence base and track factors relevant to the development of spatial data infrastructures that support green finance platforms. The implications of these could then be drawn out using established approaches in critical GIS, summarized by Elwood in her 2010 review. So before going into detail on spatial finance, it's important to understand the underlying driver, which is green finance. So theories of green finance have been variable in the past 5 years, a result of rapid market development. But to distill it down, green finance purports that given adequate information and climate smart national policy frameworks, markets are capable of efficiently allocating capital to support mitigative and adaptive actions in the real economy, thereby facilitating an orderly low carbon transition. Governments, global financial centers and markets are changing regulation, policies and practices under a greening finance agenda. And this follows a market fixing narrative, implementing strategies for increased information disclosure that enable climate related environmental risks to be internalized within the financial system, supported by initiatives that back the development and uptake of green fintech. The UK is a global player in green finance, and the timeline on this slide provides a snapshot of development from 2016 to present. Of note is 2017, which is a year of initiatives where strategic partnerships were drawn and frameworks forwarded for how to approach the challenge of scaling private finance. Of particular note is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures that identified an accounting framework for physical and transitional risk, which underpin the need for spatial data and analysis. So in this next slide, I outline a definition of spatial finance and the general operating models characterized by their data infrastructures. This highlights the link between spatial data infrastructures, platforms, and green finance outcomes. So to begin with, the definition of spatial finance here is the technological development in financial decision-making, otherwise fintech, that aims to provide insights relevant to environmental social governance on specific commercial assets, companies, parent companies, portfolios, or nations. Using geographic information systems, it links asset and observational data to inform accounting and forecasting valuations, as well as screening processes across financial markets and instruments. Notably in the literature, there is little notice given to the actual operating landscape of spatial finance, and rather an emphasis on particular models that actors believe should be forwarded, namely, in this case, the full public disclosure. As such, the typology I forward here raises three questions that I will come back to in the conclusion. How do these models create different governance regimes? How do common spatial data infrastructures that deliver different models get organized by cooperative, competing, and even conflicting interests? And what are the outcomes, both of individual model use cases and in concert? So beginning with model one, public disclosure, this model serves environmental social governance reporting. A firm will pay an auditor bound by confidentiality to process its environmental social governance data for annual reporting, which is picked up by financiers and feeds into their decision-making. This is an established model, widely criticized by finance and NGOs for a lack of standardization, detail, and metrics. It does, however, prove to be a significant part of the spatial finance market and not overly disruptive to establish relationships between finance and the real economy. And this is best described as screening. The next model, enhanced public disclosure, builds on the previous screening model, where a company such as MSCI will collect reports and augment this data with additional observational data. This platform can be queried by financiers to track environmental social governance performance of their investments and select other investments. However, it is subject to significant criticism for similar reasons as before, with a lack of transparency and data schemes that can attribute assets based on regional and even national profiles with poor data update cycles. Model 3 straddles the accounting and forecasting boundary I've called it here the full disclosure model. But to clarify, I mean asset level locations and features coupled with observational data. It is still a compliance platform, but one which can be augmented with financial profiles held by companies, accountants, and investors/insurers alike. This model is deemed the gold standard by spatial finance community and forwarded by the World Wildlife Foundation and the World Bank. However, it is dependent on accessibility of asset registers, a matter for geoprivacy policy and data availability, both of which are significant challenges which have been long faced by the GIS community. The fourth model is private disclosure, long established in insurance, particularly natural hazard insurance, where firms pass asset information to brokers or insurers. Risks are priced without the ability for wider transparency or analysis. And the fifth and final model is surveillance, which has increased awareness as a result of asset management investment firms and economy-wide consumer index positions using derivatives. An example being monitoring shipping freight and taking associated positions on retail. They are limited in the ESG applications to natural hazards, so for example, drought, but could increase with emerging markets for carbon and biodiversity offsets. So zooming back out, we can see from these models that there are a set of organizations supporting and enhancing spatial data infrastructures. These organizations have a common goal of greening finance, but are developing business models to achieve this that place them in cooperative and sometimes competitive situations. Data linking and analytical platforms add value to data, particularly when coupled to finance, but there remains an issue of where and who augments ESG data with financial data to move from compliance to forecasting, a key factor in a purported coordinated role of green finance. And transparency in data and modeling is increasingly important to achieve the overall market aims. But spatial data infrastructure arrangements establish competitive advantage required to fund business models. So the picture remains confused, as in all data economies, with concurrent efforts to increase access through commercialization and open data initiatives, both of which are forwarded under a public good rationale. And these establish a landscape for vertical integration of data value chains captured by private firms. The table outlined here tracks the stakeholders, mechanisms, market structures, and characteristic trends of spatial finance on spatial data infrastructures. And the diagram on the right illustrates a case study based on TrueCost, a particular platform tool they created called the Water Risk Monetizer in 2014. So beginning at the bottom of this diagram, we can see a company asset which we can track through, we can track the asset location data and observation data up through data portals, as well as the auditor with associated data licensing and paywalls. These are integrated in the platform, which feed into the rating agency's data flow, eventually rating a municipal water board's bond, which releases capital back to the asset. Here we can see that stakeholders and mechanisms applied to access data, the market structures that underpin these new models and trends. In the case of TrueCost, we can see how vertical integration is at play. The red box highlights the stakeholders who have negotiation power over the platform. And in the case of TrueCost, this value was largely captured by S&P Global Ratings through acquisition of TrueCost and the platform. Other trends for
1 minute left, 1 minute.
That's great. I'll move on to summary then. So that diagram provides a hook for us to look at how this zone of value capture based on competitive advantage can drive information asymmetries. Likewise, if the models do not meet industry interests or infringe on public licensing, then sources of data can be endangered. This is further complicated by missingness when you consider data available across asset types, industries, and geographies. The importance of this finding is that these information symmetries are driving the emerging and divisions of labor in green finance, both between finance and technology, as seen in fintech literatures, but also between states based on public information policy. Thus, we can draw a line from spatial data infrastructures to market functioning and green finance outcomes, and this places increasing importance on GI science and spatial data infrastructures. And this is the reason for increased regulatory interest from the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK and recent calls for climate scientists to be embedded in finance. I would add that we need GI scientists, data and infrastructure engineers, as well as research community for evaluation and criticism of this market governance system. I would end by saying that this is very much an emerging research field and one of great relevance to GI science and its role in linking financial and production networks and enabling a low carbon transition. Thanks.
I'm going to show my ignorance about spatial finance a little bit and ask a fairly simple question, I think. So in terms of open data initiatives, access to data, those privacy issues you talked about, on the ground, where do you see, say, the role of GI scientists who are very data orientated rather than maybe understanding? Sometimes an SDI can be a very high level idea, but on the ground it's a bunch of data talking to each other. So where do you see the role for, you know, people who are very data driven rather than maybe understanding the higher levels of your model, SDIs and you know, market policies, etc.?
Yeah,
you understand
absolutely.
what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think I do. Yeah, so I think there's a role as an advocacy role there for opening up public data sets where available. And there's also a role for discussing and understanding potential privacy issues. So when it comes to, particularly with SMEs, which are often small to medium-sized enterprises, which are crucial for understanding a lot of the environmental issues we have, and finance are interested in engaging with them. But obviously there's an issue around disclosure there for particularly smaller companies, which is recognized in the legal literatures as well. So there's a role for GI scientists in understanding and having conversations around what could be done and what would be deemed to be overly disclosive for particular types of organizations and companies. So yeah, that would be one feedback point. Secondly, there's also the point for GI scientists to engage with these wider infrastructures and begin to have conversations about how they can also access the data that finance is beginning to collate. So I think calls for geoportals and a more open response to data would be good, because that feeds back into the work that GI scientists are already doing within projects around environmental governance at smaller scales.
And then I suppose a question that everyone asks at this point. So you have a huge body of work done there. What's the next? What's the branching off point now? Where are you going to go to next based on the work you've done?
Yes, I think there's a couple of ways to go with it. I think one of the big ones is to highlight how this is a success story in GI innovation. So that's a really good point to make. I'd like to write up that paper. And then the next step would be to look into the actual impacts of these particular models. So going into actually doing case studies where we can see companies that have been audited using them, and then the subsequent impacts on potential financial flows. And then quantitatively, I'd like to get into looking at the actual size of this market, and starting to do some assessments of that. So to understand how geospatial data is increasing in value.